Very enough? Yeah, that's
Little
actually
fraction.
handmade in India. I can't remember where it was from.
You look like one of the Beatles.
Yeah?
Okay? Oh, that's nice. I'll remember to say Peter and I.
Could I have your attention? Welcome to the Multicultural Art Workers Gallery, the Nexus Gallery. The Multicultural Arts Workers Committee is an organisation which actively promotes cultural democracy within the community in South Australia. Tonight we have an opening of the Graduates Exhibition from Underdale students. Before I introduce the speaker, I'd like to thank Michael, who's one of the exhibiting artists, Michael Castelli, for opening with some music. I'd like to introduce Pam Zeplin, who's a senior lecturer at the South Australian School of Art at the University of South Australia at Underdale. Pam Zeplin, thank you.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome everybody to Wide Angle. And thank you, Gerda, and I'll just make a note, that is Gerda and not Greta, as was printed on the invitation. Thank you to Michael, to Castelli, and to Zeta for inviting me tonight. Now, that's a terrible echo, isn't it? It's interesting. So, I said Castelli. Okay. So just in the beginning, I have to admit to something that's less than politically correct. Now, when Mac first asked me to speak to you tonight, a couple of weeks ago, I was wondering, as one does on these occasions, why me? And obviously it's because we've all been through the cross-cultural studies unit at South Australian School of Art together, and these artists are graduands, they're not quite graduates, and I'm a lecturer. And then I thought to myself, but it's Mac. So maybe it's because I teach a cross-cultural studies unit. And then I realised that none of the students have actually done that unit. So I kept thinking, and then a slightly alarming thought came to me, and I thought, maybe I've been asked because my name is Zeplin. And that's not going to be a joke about gas bags and hot air, but the same, which I've had since childhood, but something like that actually happened to me 5 years ago, so I'll tell you about it. I was appointed to a committee of the Visual Arts and Crafts Board of the Australia Council, and after the very first gruelling day, I was sitting in a flash harbourside restaurant, Sydney Harbour of course, making small talk with the former VACB director. And he turned to me with intense surprise and he said, "But you don't have an accent." And I said, "Oh yes, I've still got a bit of a Melbourne accent, and South Australian people have a few problems with that." And he said, "No, you don't understand." He said, "You were specially chosen for this committee," and this is a true story, because you were, I've got to get this right, the non-crafts, female, academic, ethnic representative from South Australia. And he unfortunately didn't see the joke when I explained that the Zeppelins had actually colonised Australia since the 1850s. He actually turned his back on me very rudely and moved off. And I was left there, sitting there, feeling very bland and very grateful that I wasn't a bloke. It just would have been worse if I was a white Anglo-Saxon male. So even though I tried to explain to him that recently we'd been doing research and we've got the origins back to Germany and there's possible Jewish interest, no good at all. I was written off. So I mention that because of the difficulties we can all get into with boxing people into paralysing categories, especially those of ethnicity. And I wanted to emphasise 2 points very briefly. The first one is a general comment on art education around Australia. The second is about the problematic location of Nesb or Nesbian artists, as they're called. You all, I gather everyone here knows what Nesb means. So firstly, I'd suggest that the move to impose arbitrary quotas in the arts may or may not be a good idea, but I don't think it'll work. The arbitrary quotas of multiculturalism, I should say. I think they'll be ineffective until we have some basic structural change in our art school education in Australia, and those changes have to be put in place fairly soon. That is until our secondary and our tertiary art education systems come to grips with the narrowness of the focus of art education that I believe still exists in the curriculum. So that, for instance, not to push my own course, but some kind of cross-cultural studies course are no longer a sort of exotic extra or elective on the curriculum. Now, the second point is that the work of these artists here is not in any way, I don't think, contained or delimited by this underground location. And by the physical location, it really does relate across a very, very wide spectrum. And that is the cultural backgrounds, probably of everyone here, is rich and varied. And the extent of WASP influence really, and the stories of biculturalism of each artist here tonight varies very, very widely and dramatically. And it may be evident in the work, in some of the work, but it certainly doesn't necessarily dictate the content of the work. And the artists, most of the artists, felt very strongly about me saying that. If, for instance, we take a look at Castelli's poignant little books, snapshot albums, and I think we should be encouraging NESB students' snapshot albums here, about her domestic Italian experience, especially the little one called Catholicism. But please only look at them when you've got the gloves on, because they're very fragile. They're very telling and very poignant. And I defy you to identify Zita's work down the back with her Lithuanian culture. Zita's work is more about her interest in Jung and male and female principles and the vulnerability of especially females in a media-saturated world and the sort of packaging with which we have to put up with. And then Michael's delightful history biography over here, it's very idiosyncratic, and it tells an informal story of his amazingly multifaceted life. He once wrote an essay about his life that was quite staggering. Now it's very interesting. It speaks of Italy, of Michael being a fisherman and musician, but it's all carved into gum trees, which I find very, very interesting. Similarly, Gerda's magnificent tapestry over here is very sensitive but a humorous response in many ways to the old drive-in at Coopapedi, but she's put the colours through a colour photocopier. Now, all these artists have successfully got through a fairly conventional art education. They all seem quite happy with that as I've spoken to them, and they can now look back philosophically and say it's all a matter of learning the system. But I did want to say, nevertheless, that the system still has a powerful influence in moulding ideologies, and particularly those, I think unconsciously, of self-focused individualism within a fairly restricted frame, while the world, on the other hand, is becoming intensely fluid and mobile. All ethnicities are undergoing profound change. All borders are now under challenge, and a wide-angled perspective is absolutely necessary. Even I think 2 nights ago, you may have seen the program on TV, Lateline I think it was, that talked about in excess of 60 million refugees of the third world, as they call it, heading towards the first world. And they must be accommodated, maybe even in Adelaide, maybe even in our art schools. Multiculturalism, or whatever more correct term we may choose to use, can no longer remain a minority experience. It is the reality of all our futures. Nevertheless, power relations are yet to be worked out, and the rapid change that is upon us may not necessarily bring cultural equity, of course. And that's why organisations like MAC and this little gallery are very important to artists who find themselves somewhat displaced from an Anglo-dominated art world. So MAC is essential for actually building confidence and for literally offering a space for difference. However, in the long term, this gallery really is and should be, as Peter Bock said yesterday, working towards its own obsolescence. So congratulations to the artists who've done a great job, and I'd like to remind you of the fact that most of them are for sale at bargain prices. And there's just a little note I'll add from Michael Castelli. He wished me to mention he wanted to thank all the lecturers for their understanding and encouragement given while he was studying at Underdale, and he listed Barry Goddard, Vitas Capucinus, Tony Bishop, Max Lyle, Sean Kirby, George Popplewell and Jack Cross. So thank you very much, and I'll declare the show open. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam, for those words. You're now welcome to continue viewing the exhibition and help yourselves to drinks and some refreshments. Thank you.